Mia had always found comfort in solitude. Her days were spent in the quiet corners of her bookstore, surrounded by the scent of aged paper and the gentle hum of the city outside. While the world around her bustled with life, Mia preferred the predictable company of her books. She never imagined her routine would be disrupted by someone like Lucas. It happened one stormy evening. Rain pounded against the windows as Mia worked late, organizing shelves. The street outside was unusually quiet until a commotion caught her attention. She hesitated, peering through the window. A man was staggering, clutching his side, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering streetlight. Her heart raced when she realized he was injured. Mia debated whether to intervene. He looked dangerous, with his sharp features and intense gaze, but she couldn't ignore the human in need. Grabbing her umbrella, she stepped outside. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. The man looked up, surprised. His eyes, a piercing gray, studied her briefly before he muttered, "I'm fine." But he wasn't. Blood seeped through his shirt, and he winced as he tried to stand straight. Without thinking, Mia offered him her arm. "You need help," she insisted. Reluctantly, he accepted, allowing her to guide him into the bookstore. Inside, under the warm glow of the lights, his intimidating presence became more apparent. Tall and broad-shouldered, he looked out of place among the shelves of novels and poetry. Mia fetched a first-aid kit, her hands trembling as she cleaned his wound. "This might sting," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. He watched her intently, his expression unreadable. "You're not afraid of me?" She paused, meeting his gaze. "Should I be?" A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Most people would be." Mia didn't press further, sensing he wouldn't offer more than he wanted. When she finished, he stood, adjusting his jacket. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now. "You didn't have to do this." "It's nothing," she replied, avoiding his gaze. As he left, Mia felt a strange mix of relief and curiosity. She watched him disappear into the night, the rain swallowing his figure. For the rest of the evening, her mind replayed the encounter. Who was he? Why was he hurt? And why did she feel a strange pull towards someone so clearly dangerous? She shook her head, dismissing the thoughts. It was just a moment of kindness, nothing more. Yet, deep down, she couldn't ignore the unease settling in her chest. What Mia didn't know was that Lucas, the man she helped, was the city's most notorious gangster, a man who thrived in chaos and danger. And by stepping into his world, even briefly, she had unknowingly set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. Mia didn't expect to see him again, but Lucas had a way of making the unexpected seem inevitable. He began visiting the bookstore, always at odd hours, when the streets were quieter and fewer people would notice. At first, his presence unnerved her. He didn't quite fit into her world of quiet stories and predictable routines. But he had a charm that was hard to ignore, and the way he spoke, as if every word mattered, began to draw her in. He would browse the shelves with an air of curiosity, occasionally pulling out a book to inspect it. "Any recommendations?" he asked one evening, his voice steady, but with a hint of playfulness. Caught off guard, Mia hesitated. "What kind of stories do you like?" "Ones where people find what they're looking for," he replied, his gaze fixed on her. Mia felt her cheeks flush, but quickly turned to the shelves. She handed him a novel, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. "This one's about second chances," she said softly. He took it without looking at the cover. Second chances sound good. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas became a fixture in her life. He never overstayed his welcome, but his visits became something Mia looked forward to, even if she wouldn't admit it to herself. He was careful not to reveal too much about his world, but little by little, he let his guard down. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the bookstore, Lucas spoke of his past. "I didn't choose this life," he began, his voice unusually vulnerable. "But once you're in, it's hard to get out." Mia listened intently, her heart aching at the weight he seemed to carry. "Why don't you leave?" she asked gently. He let out a bitter laugh. "It's not that simple. People like me don't just walk away." But you could, she insisted, her voice filled with quiet determination. You're not defined by your past. Her words seemed to linger in the air, and for the first time, Lucas looked at her with something resembling hope. Their connection grew deeper with every conversation. Lucas showed Mia a side of the city she'd never seen before: hidden gardens, quiet alleys where the noise of the world faded away, places that felt like their own little universe. In return, Mia shared her dreams, her love for stories, and the way she saw the world through a lens of endless possibility. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of danger. Lucas's world wasn't one that allowed for softness or vulnerability, and his enemies were starting to notice his absence. He tried to shield Mia from it, but she could sense the tension in his demeanor, the way his eyes would scan the room as if searching for unseen threats. Still, Mia held on to the belief that he could change, that their connection could be something more than a fleeting moment in a chaotic world. Lucas, in turn, began to believe it too. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to build a life that wasn't defined by fear and violence. But as their bond deepened, so did the stakes, and the fragile balance they had found was destined to be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. Mia's heart sank the moment she saw him. She had gone to return a book to a friend across town, but as she walked by an abandoned lot, she froze. There was Lucas, surrounded by men who radiated danger. They were arguing, their voices sharp and threatening. Before she could turn away, one of the men lunged at Lucas, and in a swift, practiced move, he disarmed him, the weapon clattering to the ground. She couldn't believe her eyes. The gentle, introspective man who shared stories with her was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and terrifyingly efficient. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile this side of him with the Lucas she thought she knew. That night, she confronted him. "I saw you," she said, her voice trembling. Lucas didn't flinch. "Mia, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" she demanded, her frustration breaking through. "Because from where I was standing, it looked exactly like what I've been trying to ignore all along." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told you my world was complicated. I never wanted you to see that part of it. But it is a part of you," she replied, her voice softening. "And you can't pretend it's not." Lucas looked at her, his expression pained. "I'm trying to get out, Mia. For you. But it's not something I can fix overnight." The sincerity in his voice tugged at her heart, but the fear she had felt watching him in that moment was something she couldn't shake. "I can't do this, Lucas," she whispered. "I can't be part of a world where violence is the answer." He reached for her, but she stepped back. "Please, Mia, don't give up on me," he pleaded. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "I don't know if I can." Over the next few days, Mia tried to distance herself from Lucas, throwing herself into her work to keep her mind occupied. But her thoughts were never far from him. Every time the door of the bookstore opened, her heart would leap, only to sink when it wasn't him. She hated how much she missed him, even after everything. Meanwhile, Lucas was spiraling. Without Mia, the hope he had clung to felt fragile and distant. He tried to focus on finding a way out of his life, but his enemies weren't willing to let him go quietly. Word had spread that he was distracted, and in his world, distractions were weaknesses. Mia's worst fears were realized when she received a threatening message. It was clear that someone had discovered their connection, and they weren't afraid to use it against him. Panic set in as she realized just how deep she had been pulled into his world. Terrified, Mia decided to leave the city. She packed her things quietly, determined to escape before she became a pawn in someone else's game. As she boarded the train, her heart ached for the life she was leaving behind, but she told herself it was for the best. Before the train pulled away, her phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. "I'll fix this. I promise. Just don't lose faith in me." Mia stared at the screen, torn between the love she still felt and the fear that their connection would destroy them both. As the train began to move, she closed her eyes, praying she had made the right choice. Mia had spent a year trying to forget Lucas, but no matter how far she ran, he lingered in her thoughts. She had moved to a small town far from the city, finding solace in simplicity. Her days were quiet, filled with writing and rebuilding herself. She wrote about love, loss, and hope, stories that mirrored the turmoil she had left behind. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to move on, a part of her heart remained tethered to him. One day, a letter arrived in her mailbox, unmarked but unmistakably from Lucas. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her pulse quickening with every word. He wrote about the steps he had taken to leave his old life behind, the sacrifices he made to ensure she would be safe. He confessed his regret for not being the man she deserved and admitted he didn't know if he ever could be. But he also wrote about hope, about the possibility of a life free from shadows, even if it meant staying away from her. Mia read the letter over and over, her emotions a storm of confusion and longing. She wanted to hate him for the pain he had caused, but the sincerity in his words made it impossible. She could feel the weight of his transformation, the lengths he had gone to for her. He ended the letter with a simple promise: if you ever want to find me, I'll be waiting. Days turned into weeks as Mia wrestled with her feelings. Part of her wanted to leave the past where it belonged, to continue the safe, quiet life she had built. But another part, the part that still loved him, couldn't let go of the possibility that they could find a way forward together. Finally, unable to ignore her heart any longer, Mia made the decision to see him. She followed the clues in his letter, which led her to a small countryside home far from the chaos of the city. It was a modest place, surrounded by fields and trees, a world away from the life Lucas had once lived. As she approached the house, her heart pounded. What if he hadn't really changed? What if she was walking back into a world of heartbreak and danger? But as she stood at the door, she reminded herself of the courage it had taken him to leave his old life behind. She knocked, each sound echoing her racing thoughts. The door opened and there he was. Lucas looked different, his sharp edges softened, his eyes less burdened. He froze when he saw her, as if he couldn't believe she was real. "Mia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what to say. For a moment, they simply stood there, the distance between them filled with all the words they hadn't spoken. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I wanted to see if we could still find a way." Lucas nodded, his own eyes glistening. "I've been waiting for you." As they stood there, the past still lingered, but so did the promise of a future, a chance to build something new together. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Mia felt a glimmer of hope. Sometimes love was worth the risk,